Yo, what is up, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and today we're going to talk about the Los Angeles Clippers. They've been in title conversations ever since they got Paul George and Kawhi Leonard in the same offseason, immediately giving them one of the top three duos in the entire NBA. Add in a pretty solid supporting cast around them, and for a while, the Clippers have been talked about as one of the championship favorites. Of course, things haven't quite gone their way, with the 3-1 lead being blown against the Nuggets, last season being, kind of in a good spot to win the West. However, falling to the Phoenix Suns in the Western Conference Finals after Kawhi tore his ACL in the second round against the Jazz. And then this past year, with Kawhi missing the whole season and Paul George missing part of the year, they ended up bowing out in the play-in tournament. It has not gone to plan since those two guys came to town. However, due to a combination of great roster moves and just all around making good decisions over the course of the past few years, I believe the Clippers right now are in position to be one of the best teams in the NBA this upcoming season. And for me, I think they're probably my title favorites in the Western Conference, which is a lot to say. However, I'm going to talk about why I believe in this Clippers team so much and why I think they've got a pretty good shot to win it all. Leave a like and subscribe if you do enjoy. And let's start off this conversation by talking about this Clippers roster as a whole, centering around Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. Now, one thing I do want to say before I get into it is that I think this is the best Clippers team we have ever seen. Maybe there's some team I'm forgetting about back in the 80s or 90s before I was born, but at least in the time I've been alive, this is the best Clippers roster we've ever seen. And of course, it starts with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, two guys who are both top 15 players in the league. And starting with Kawhi Leonard, he is coming off of an ACL injury, but I'm honestly not too concerned about that. He's not a player who relies on athleticism a lot, which is one of the main concerns with guys coming off of those major injuries like an ACL, so I think he'll be perfectly fine. He doesn't rely on that athleticism to really dominate the game like some other players do, so some other players might struggle more with the ACL. Plus, he took a whole year off to get ready. There are rumors that maybe he could come back for a playoff run last season, but I'm glad that he didn't, so that he's able to stay healthy and come into this upcoming season playing like the top 5 player that we know, which he was a consensus top 5 player prior to injury. And I believe that when he comes back, he'll probably be a little bit rusty, but Kawhi kind of just feels like a guy who, there are all those memes about him just being a robot and being like a Terminator for basketball. I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back and immediately looks like that player again, because it seems like Kawhi just never misses a beat. I think at worst, when he returns, he'll be a top 10 player in the league, and if he comes back to the level that he was playing at prior to injury, then this Clippers team gets super scary. Additionally, he's one of the best playoff performers in recent history. Since 2017, Kawhi Leonard in the playoffs has averaged 29.5 points per game, 8.6 rebounds, 4.5 assists, and 2 steals on 51, 38.3, and 89% splits. It is incredible the way he has dominated the playoffs. And last year, in 10 games in the playoffs prior to tearing his ACL, he was averaging 30.4 points per game, 7.7 rebounds, and 4.4 assists on 57% shooting, 39% from 3, and 88% from the free throw line. He was dominating. And you might remember some of those crazy games, like Game 6 against the Mavericks, where he put the team on his back. Kawhi has always been an incredible playoff performer. He is a guy that, regardless of how he plays in the regular season, while he's kind of ramping back up to the level that he was playing at last season, by the time the playoffs roll around, Kawhi Leonard is going to absolutely take over. So I have absolutely no worries about Kawhi Leonard being phenomenal when he comes back, especially in the playoffs. And while he isn't a defensive player of the year caliber guy anymore, especially coming off of that injury, he's still a great defender. Then you go over to Paul George, who played like an MVP candidate prior to his injury last season. He averaged 24.7 points, 7.1 rebounds, and 5.5 assists in 26 games before he got hurt, and would end up missing 50 games before coming back for a few at the end of the year, and then missing the last game of the season in the play-in tournament. He did end up playing phenomenally too in the 2021 playoffs. He averaged 27 points per game, 9.6 rebounds, and 5.4 assists. He quieted the playoff P narratives, and after Kawhi Leonard went down, Paul George took over and led the Clippers past the Utah Jazz and to 6 games against the Phoenix Suns, who were really good. And he did that without Kawhi Leonard, a top 5 player in the league at that point. So Paul George quieted all the playoff P narratives that he can't play in the playoffs. He's a guy that I think could have a sneaky case for MVP this upcoming season if Kawhi Leonard does miss some rehab time, which I expect he'd miss at least a few games. And of course, Paul George, he's also a good defender too. And those two guys play really well off of each other. They can both play well well on ball or off ball, and they're two players that just complement each other's skill sets really well. I think regardless of the injuries they both suffered, and they're getting a little bit older now, I think that they will be a top 3 duo in basketball next season. Now, like I've talked about a few times, injuries are a bit of a concern. You have Paul George and Kawhi Leonard coming off of decent injuries, and while I'm not super worried about them in terms of them coming back and playing at a high level, there's always the chance that they suffer re-injuries, or, one of them misses 20, 30 games at some point, or they get to the playoffs. Even if they're dominating, if one of those guys goes down, it gets a lot harder to compete against what is a really deep Western Conference. However, especially in the regular season, this team is plenty deep enough to allow each of them to take some rest games, which should potentially mitigate some of those injuries. Last year, the Clippers, like I said, were without Paul George for a majority of the season and didn't have Kawhi the whole year. In games without PG, the Clippers still went 24-27, missing 2 top 15 players in the league. They were just under 500, and that, for a full season's pace, would have given them 38.5 wins, which puts them as the 10 seed without Kawhi or Paul George for a whole season. They also went 18-13 with Paul George, of course also without Kawhi Leonard, which would have given them 47.5 wins on the season, good for the 7th seed. And that's without Kawhi, who was a top 5 player before injury. So this team, regardless of if Kawhi or Paul George have to take nights off, they have a deep enough roster that allows them to compete every single night, regardless of if those guys are on the court or not, which gives them, plenty of chances to rest up before the playoffs and try and mitigate that risk of injury when they head into things. That brings me to the point where they have the deepest roster in the league. Let's go ahead and walk through some of the players. Of course, we already talked about Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, who I believe will start at the 2 and the 3, or maybe at the 3 and the 4, depends on if you want to start Norman Powell or have him as a guy off the bench, or if you start Nick Batum, who's a great 3-and-D role player for the team and has started the past couple seasons. I lean towards Nick Batum because I think it makes sense to have him in that role and have Norman Powell off the bench. You could also kind of mix and match depending on what your matchups are, but let's just say they have a starting lineup that includes Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, Nick Batum, John Wall, who is one of their biggest pickups over this past offseason, who gives them a really capable facilitator, which is something they've been missing for pretty much every single year that they've had this Kawhi Leonard, Paul George duo. Since Chris Paul, they haven't had this really great facilitating point guard, and now they have John Wall to do that. A lot of people are saying oh, John Wall's not good anymore, which, yeah, he's not great. Last time we saw him in Houston, he was really struggling, but they don't need him to do much. Kawhi and Paul George can both give you 25 plus points on any given night. They'll both probably average between 23 and 25 points. John Wall doesn't have to score. All he has to do is facilitate. If he puts up numbers like 13 points and 7 assists, that's perfect. That is all that they need from John Wall. And he acknowledged in an interview before this season that he knows that he's really not that guy anymore in terms of being a franchise player. He knows that he's a bit older. He knows that he's dealt with injuries. And with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George on the court, he's a guy that's going to focus a bit more on playmaking and facilitating. And with how many offensive options this Clippers team has, that is such a valuable asset to have. Because regardless of John Wall, getting a bit older, being a player who doesn't have quite as quick of a first step and isn't much of a scorer anymore, he still has incredible playmaking chops, which is going to be huge for Kawhi and Paul George, as well as the other options on this team. All he has to do, like I said, is average just into double-digit points and 6-7 assists a night, and he's going to be immensely valuable to this team while also playing at least decent defense. Then you've got Nick Batum, like I've mentioned, and Zubac at the center. Really solid defensively. He can finish plays. Zubats. He's going to make things happen. Then off the bench, you've got Reggie Jackson, who has been their starting point guard the past few seasons and is very capable of being a starter. You've got Luke Kennard, who was the league's best shooter percentage-wise this past season and finished 5th in 6th Man of the Year voting. So he's a guy who isn't even their 6th man off the bench. That was 5th in 6th Man of the Year voting last year. The probably first guy off the bench is Norman Powell, who averaged 19 points per game last season. 19 points per game is going to be a guy that's coming off the bench now. You've also got Robert Covington, a great 3-and-D player. Marcus Morris, who could start on most teams in the league. Terrence Mann, who dropped 30-plus points in that Game 6 against the Jazz a year ago. Brandon Boston Jr., who has shown a ton of potential as a young draft pick. Amir Coffey, who just got an extension, and Moses Brown. They've got 4 6th Man of the Year capable guys off the bench in Reggie Jackson, Luke Kennard, Norman Powell, and Marcus Morris, plus other pieces around them. That is a legit 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 13 guys that can play on most teams in the league that a few of them aren't going to play every night. That's insane, the amount of depth that they have. Legitimately, Reggie, Kennard, Norman Pound, Marcus Morris could all be Sixth Man of the Year contenders on other teams. Of course, being on the same team now, all their touches are going to kind of equal each other out. They're not going to average as many points, but that is an incredible bench lineup that they can throw out there. Really, their only thing that they're missing is a true backup big. I mentioned Moses Brown. I don't see him as being a super capable backup big, so maybe they'll make that acquisition over the course of the season. But other than that, there's really no holes in this team. They've got great shooters. They've got guys that can facilitate, guys that can defend. They have a little bit of everything on this roster. And that's not to mention Tyronn Lue being an incredible coach. In my opinion, a top 3, top 2, might even be the best. I think he was the best coach in the league last season, is what I will say. At worst, in my opinion, he is top 3. He has proven a lot of people wrong. People who thought, oh, he wasn't a great coach. It was just kind of, he coached LeBron James in that really talented Cleveland Cavaliers squad, which is why they won a championship. But no, Tyronn Lue has shown how great he is at adjustments, especially in the playoffs. His ability to go down 2-0 in series and then make a immediate adjustment. After 2 games, he's like, oh, okay, this is what we have to do, and then just clean sweeps the rest of the series. It is really, really impressive what he is able to do in the playoffs. And like I said last season, missing Kawhi and Paul George for most of the season with Paul George and the whole season with Kawhi, still being able to be right around a 500 team over those games without them is super, super impressive. It not only speaks to the depth, but it speaks to the coaching staff and Tyronn Lue in particular. And finally, there's really no dominant team in the NBA right now. There are a lot of really good teams: the Golden State Warriors, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Sixers, the Nuggets, the Celtics, the Suns. Those 6 teams are kind of the top tier teams in my mind at the moment, and none of them are like a super team. There isn't any super dominant force in the NBA right now, meaning that things are super wide open. The fact that there are those 6 teams and then the Clippers, in my opinion, that make up about 7 contenders, 7 teams that right now I could see winning the NBA Finals, it shows how open the league is at the moment. So the Clippers have 2 guys who are one of the best duos in the league, and if they're able to stay healthy, which it should help them that they're able to with a pretty deep squad that can allow them to take rest nights, they should be phenomenal this upcoming season. The deepest roster in the league, one of the best coaches in the league, and a lack of dominant teams. I think the Clippers are positioned to potentially win the Western Conference if they stay healthy, which is, of course, the big caveat with this roster. But if they do stay healthy, in my opinion, the Clippers are probably the best team in the league, and it might be hard to stop them on any given night. What do you think about the Clippers? Let me know in the comment section below. I appreciate y'all watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you do enjoy. I'll see y'all later. Real One, say it back.